to you from Seoul. I'm Kwon Jang-ho, and it's good to have you with us. Sanctions on North Korea has been the cause of much tension this week, with Seoul and Washington showing cracks in their relationship over the issue, while Beijing and Moscow calls on the need for change. Pyongyang has responded by declaring that it will not give in to the pressure. But is that because they are indeed feeling the heat? We'll get more into that discussion later in the show, but first we turn to Devin Whiting at the News Centre, who has the latest headlines for us. Devin?
Hi, Jang-ho. Yes, in the meantime, things are continuing apace between South and North Korea. They'll be holding high-level talks next week for the first time since the Inter-Korean Summit last month in Pyongyang. Seoul's Unification Ministry announced today that the meeting will be held on Monday at the Peace House on the South Korean side of Panmunjom. The South Korean delegation will be led by Unification Minister Cho Myung-gyun, who will be joined by the vice ministers of departments related to items in the Pyeongyang Joint Declaration. The two sides will discuss ways to implement the declaration, which aims to promote peace and prosperity on the Korean Peninsula. President Moon Jae-in will embark Saturday on a lengthy trip through Europe, meeting with leaders there to update them on Seoul's diplomatic push with North Korea. Our Shin Se-min has more on the president's schedule.
President Moon Jae-in will be leaving on a 9-day trip to Europe with the objective of keeping his European counterparts in the loop on the fast-evolving peace project on the Korean Peninsula.
President Moon will be explaining the positive developments happening on the Korean Peninsula, including the respective summits between the two Koreas and the U.S., while expressing gratitude for EU member nations' support for peace in the region.
With that goal in mind, the president will be on a state visit to France for 4 days from the 13th. His schedule there includes a summit with the French president, as well as a friendly cultural event with Koreans living abroad and some French Hallyu enthusiasts. Among the performers at the event will be the record-setting K-pop sensation BTS. From the 16th, the president will be in Rome, holding summits with the Italian president and prime minister, to be followed by a highly anticipated meeting with Pope Francis, where the discussion of peace on the Korean Peninsula is likely to reach its peak. President Moon will be passing on to the pontiff an invitation to Pyongyang from North Korea's Kim Jong-un, who had reportedly told the president that he would ardently welcome the Pope should he visit the regime. And during his stay there, the president will also participate in a special Mass for Peace on the Korean Peninsula at St. Peter's Basilica, presided over by the Cardinal Secretary of State, Pietro Parolin. Then comes a 2-day stay in Brussels, where President Moon will be attending the Asia-Europe meeting, or ASEM, where he will address European nations on his administration's plans to plant the seeds of peace in the region. Finally, at the last destination of his Europe trip, the president will land in Copenhagen on the 19th for the P4G Copenhagen Summit, where he will speak about the Global Coalition on Sustainable Development. He will then arrive back home on Sunday, the 21st. The president's tight schedule covers a comprehensive set of issues, from North Korea to new industries and even sustainable development. But the presidential office underlines that the most pressing topic of all is again connecting with Europe and advancing the new order of peace and stability on the divided peninsula. Shin Se-min, Arirang News.
And on the eve of his trip to Europe, President Moon gave an interview to the BBC about what he hopes to accomplish. The president is reported to have shared his vision of ways to build peace on the Korean Peninsula and to drum up support from the international community. That interview will air at 8 p.m. Korea time, and the full-length video of the interview will be made available on Tuesday. President Moon also gave an interview to the French newspaper Le Figaro, which will be published in Europe on Monday the 15th. As the trade war between the U.S. and China escalates, President Trump has warned there's a lot more he could do to hurt China's economy. But he and Xi Jinping will have a chance to work things out when they meet, likely next month, on the sidelines of the G20 summit. Noah Adam has this report.
In an interview on Fox News on Thursday, President Trump praised his tariffs on Chinese imports. He said they've had a, quote, big impact in damaging China's economy, claiming Washington's trade deficit with Beijing has gone down substantially. The Trump administration has so far imposed tariffs on $250 million worth of Chinese goods, with Beijing retaliating in kind. President Trump added he could do a lot more if he wanted to, but said he would prefer Beijing come to the negotiating table. He said although the Chinese want to negotiate, he does not believe they are ready. He also blamed previous US presidents for allowing China to pursue unfair trade practices and said he had to tell Beijing, quote, "It's over." Despite the rhetoric, Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping are reportedly set to meet soon to try and diffuse tensions. The Wall Street Journal, citing officials in both countries, reported that the two leaders will meet at the G20 summit in Argentina late next month. The meeting was said to have been pushed by US Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin and White House economic advisor Larry Kudlow. The ongoing trade spat between the two world powers has taken its toll on the global economy. The IMF has cited the trade war as one of the reasons it lowered its 2019 growth forecast for China, which is set to see its slowest expansion since 1990. The IMF has also lowered estimates for the United States and the global economy as a whole. Noaram, Arirang News.
We're now into day 3 of South Korea's National Assembly's audit of the government. During the inspection of the Ministry of SMEs, rival parties clashed over the government's minimum wage hike. The opposition party said that it's forced small businesses to shut down or cut down on part-time workers because of the additional costs. They added that the government's push to shorten working hours is not helping either, as this has resulted in smaller paychecks and a reluctance to spend money. But the ruling party acknowledged that while there have been unintended consequences, structural issues are to blame, arguing that what's needed is a change in economic paradigm, even if there are negative effects along the way. At the Science Committee audit, up for debate was the government's drive to pursue nuclear-free energy. The opposition criticized the plans and pointed out potential side effects, such as a decline in energy supply, while the ruling party defended the initiative, saying it's the path the country will have to take eventually, and that it was taken in consideration of people's safety. South Korea has been struggling with employment this year, but data show things improved somewhat in September. The nation added 45,000 new jobs compared to the same time last year. Kim Ji-yeon has the numbers.
The number of newly employed in Korea climbed modestly in September, providing partial relief after the employment shock seen in the months of July and August. Data by Statistics Korea shows 45,000 people were newly employed in September, with the total number of people in the workforce tallied at over 27 million. The health and social services sectors accounted for most of the job gains, followed by telecommunications as well as farming and fisheries sectors. Meanwhile, the number of newly employed people in the rental services, wholesale and retail sectors, as well as lodging and food industries, dropped on year last month. The statistics agency says the downtrend in the services sectors are mainly due to heightened competition and a dip in the number of Chinese tourists visiting Korea. The number of new jobs in the manufacturing sector, meanwhile, rose by a mere 42,000 last month compared to a year ago, mainly due to the prolonged slump in the shipbuilding and auto sectors, which have been undergoing restructuring. Korea's jobless rate overall stood at 3.6% last month, which is a 0.3 percentage point increase from the same period last year. The youth unemployment rate decreased by 0.4 percentage points on year to stand at 8.8%, but the real youth unemployment rate rose to its highest level since related data was first compiled in 2015 to 22.7% last month. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
I'm Devin Whiting, and those are your news headlines.
North Korea is continuing to press the US to alleviate the sanctions on it, while Washington is firm that those sanctions cannot be loosened until it sees real denuclearization. In fact, Washington is raising the pressure, even blocking humanitarian visits to the regime. Oh Jung-hee reports.
Continue the sanctions, we won't give in, says North Korea. Pyongyang state-run newspaper Nodong Sinmun released an op-ed on Friday. It didn't explicitly mention or target the United States, but strongly denounced the international sanctions, saying that Pyongyang's, quote, enemies are intensifying them. The op-ed says these so-called enemies think North Korea will give up in the end, but it won't. Pyongyang, it says, will instead keep up with its self-reliant spirit to ultimately build a strong state despite external influences. Recently, North Korea has been calling for the international sanctions to be eased because it has taken steps towards denuclearization. But the U.S. is firm in keeping the pressure on North Korea. And recently, this appears to be not only through economic sanctions, but restrictions on humanitarian aid as well. According to the Wall Street Journal, Washington is blocking aid workers from traveling to the north, and the decision maker is the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. The reason, apparently, the possibility that North Korea could misuse the humanitarian assistance for its nuclear weapons program. Meanwhile, there are growing calls from other corners too for sanctions relief, namely China and Russia, as the North works to strengthen ties with its traditional allies. Just this week, the vice foreign ministers of Pyongyang, Beijing, and Moscow had three-way talks where they called on the UN Security Council to review the sanctions and for the relevant parties to take reciprocal actions. With the U.S. determined to keep the sanctions in place until denuclearization happens, it's not clear what crucial common ground Pyongyang and Washington will be able to find next in their nuclear negotiations. Oh Jung-hee, Arirang News.
For more on that issue, we have with us Dr. Oh Jung-hee from the Sejong Institute. It's good to have you back on the show, Professor.
My pleasure.
So, sanctions seem to be the key issue this week, and North Korea has given their response to the ongoing international sanctions. They're basically saying, bring it. What do you make of this response?
So I think that there are like three purposes that North Korea wanted to show by having this op-ed on its state-run newspaper. First, they want to send a message to its own domestic audiences. Because of the smooth in the improved inter-Korean relations, there might be some hope that North Korean citizens might have. So, but since that, given that the denuclearization period will take for a long time, I think North Korean government wants to send a message that you have to endure more time in the future. And second, North Korea wants to send a message to the U.S. that North Korea is not vulnerable because of your pressure on North Korean economy. So they want to have a superior position in negotiating with the United States. And third, by having this kind of argument, North Korea focuses more on sanction issues rather than the declaration to end the war issue. Because now the weight of the discussion is moving toward easing sanctions these days. So I think North Korea probably saw that it might be helpful for them if the discussion is more about the sanctions rather than declaration to end the war.
Well, it seems the US are not backing down either. There are now reports coming out of the Wall Street Journal which says that Washington is also blocking humanitarian aid to aid workers to North Korea as well. A sign perhaps the US is continuing to have difficulties negotiating a denuclearization program with North Korea. What do you think, Professor?
So basically they are not blocking the humanitarian aid because the current US law banning the travel by the US citizen to North Korea, US government has to issue special passport for those who want to visit North Korea. And so that in the UN Security Council, they have this process of expediting the humanitarian aid to North Korea. But this time, U.S. government is actually blocking U.S. citizens visiting North Korea, even though the purpose of visit is humanitarian aid. So I think that it's political and also it has a diplomatic purpose because North Korea and the United States is now going to have a second summit in the near future. So United States wants to put more pressure on North Korea as the second summit between Trump and Kim is forthcoming soon. So I think U.S. is not sending a message that they are going to block humanitarian itself, but the citizen of the U.S. citizens are still under the U.S. law banning the travel to North Korea. At the same time, that U.S. still wants to maintain the maximum pressure to North Korea.
So it seems both the US and North Korea are giving pressure on each other with these various kind of statements and actions as well. But from this situation, can there be a second a summit? Can there be talks going on underneath that are moving towards some sort of plan for denuclearization, do you think?
So I think that both leaders have strong incentive to have and continue the dialogue with each other. For President Trump, it is very important for him to show his success in diplomatic area. And for Kim Jong-un, and I think it's very important for him to continue to this charm offense or the engaging with the United States to ultimately achieve the easing sanctions for North Korean economy. So I think there's still incentive for both the leaders, but since the deliverables out of summit is very important, that is why they are still have this kind of small battles before the summit to achieve more deliverables for their own interest, respectively.
So this situation right now comes, of course, while in the middle of this week, the Moon administration continued to try and sort out this this controversial situation over comments made by the Foreign Minister Kang Kyung-hwa, who said Seoul was reviewing its sanctions on North Korea. The Seoul has pretty much backtracked on this, saying that there is no formal kind of review on this, but that they will still stay flexible. Trump, of course, reacted rather undiplomatically, saying that South Korea can make no decision without US approval. How damaging is this recent incident to the US-South Korea alliance? Isn't it? Don't they need to be on the same side at the moment?
I think every alliance system has their own area of conflicts. For South Korea and the United States currently has the problems or the differences in their opinions how to deal with North Korea. So now South Korean government believe that easing the sanctions might lead to the ultimate denuclearization of North Korea, whereas U.S. government believes that easing the sanctions actually blocked any possibility of denuclearization of North Korea. That is why it is so sensitive when Minister Kang mentioned during the National Assembly audit that South Korean government is actually considering the easing sanctions, which is May 24th measure, which was made in 2010. And as you just mentioned, the President Trump mentioned that South Korea would not do anything without their approval. But I think the question from the journalist to the President Trump is not about South Korean measures. The question was South Korean government is considering the easing sanctions. So I think President Trump probably mentioned that any waiver to the sanctions should be approved by the U.S. government or the UN Security Council. So I think it's not diplomatic, but we should not think that there's like big problems between two governments.
So you don't think there's going to be some sort of slight lasting animosity there at all?
I don't think so. Yeah, there's a conflict, arguments, and disputes, even the close allies. But they have strong histories in the past that they can manage these kind of issues.
President Moon will be setting off for a 9-day trip around Europe from Saturday. So the Blue House said he will try to garner support from the EU to EU countries on North Korea. The question is, what message do you think he will be sending to them? Because, I mean, do you think President Moon has any intention to maybe discuss with the certain countries, especially France, who's a UN Security Council member, about sanctions, about possibly starting to ease sanctions? Do you think that's on the cards yet? Or do you think that is something else that he will talk to them about later?
President Moon already made a speech at the UN General Assembly last month that international community has to respond positively to the efforts made by North Korea. And what he meant at the speech was that since North Korea is putting their efforts into the denuclearization and opening their society and the economy, international community should reward them. So he did not, President Moon did not specify what that reward is, but many observers thought that that reward might be easing some kind of sanctions. So I think that President Moon is going to reiterate his message that was given at the UN National Assembly last month, but it's going to be very politically difficult for him to directly ask EU countries that they have to ease the sanctions on North Korea.
Russia and North Korea have announced that its leaders, Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin, exchanged messages to mark the 70th anniversary of their bilateral ties. And also earlier this week as well, there was Che Son-hee, the Vice Foreign Minister. She went to Moscow to meet and had a trilateral meeting with her Chinese and Russian counterparts, where they released a joint communique, also calling on the need for possible adjustment on international sanctions on North Korea. So all this sanctions-related pressure is coming out from that side as well. Do you think that Kim Jong-un is now really trying to coordinate his countries, his allies, China and Russia, to kind of fight against these sanctions pressure as well?
So we have observed this kind of diplomatic efforts by North Korea this year. So when North Korea decided to have a summit with the United States, the first diplomatic efforts that they put is reestablish its relations with China and Russia. So the relationship between North Korea and China has been so cold, and there is no formal exchange at the government level last year. But I think that North Korea needs the strong support from two close countries like China and Russia to have a negotiation with the United States. So there's going to be a second summit between President Trump and Chairman Kim. North Korea needs to reestablish its ties with China and Russia, and also garner their support for having voices on easing the sanctions at the UN Security Council. So I think from North Korean point of view, it's very natural for him to have this kind of diplomatic efforts.
And one other development that's happened today as well, it's been announced that high-level inter-Korean talks will take place next week at Panmunjom. Now, this comes, without, a little bit of a surprise, but what do you think they will talk about? What is the subject that they are trying to sort out now?
So the Ministry of Unification said that it's the discussions at the high-level talks next week is about to follow up the Pyeongyang Declaration and the details of North Korea's performance group performing in Seoul in October, and also a lot of detailed discussion on how to make unitary sports team in the upcoming sports events in the Asia. So I think it's not about the denuclearization of North Korea issues, but focus is more given to the inter-Korean relations and the follow-up of Panmunjom and Pyongyang joint declarations.
And finally, let's touch upon one more subject. So President Trump, during an interview with on Fox and Friends in the US on Thursday, he bragged about his good relationship with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, and stressing how there had been no missile or nuclear tests in the last year. He also described Pompeo as a star for going to North Korea, and again for trying to arrange future talks for another summit. Now, it seems to be that he's really as he's coming up to these midterm elections that are so important to him, that he's pounding out his achievements on North Korea. But Dr. Hu, just as an overall assessment, how do you review his achievements on North Korea so far this year?
So it is a progress that North Korea has not made any provocations with regard to its nuclear and missile capabilities. So I think we should admit that it's achievement by Trump administration. But at the same time that it's not enough for us to consider that North Korea is in the direction of denuclearization yet. Because for the true denuclearization of North Korea, there's a certain process that we have to follow, and North Korea is not exactly in that step yet. So President Trump wants to show off that this is what he achieved, which has not been possible by the previous administration. And that is why he emphasized the differences between him and the previous administration of the United States for the domestic political purpose. So I think that we have to see how the second summit between Trump and Kim is going to turn out. But so far, I think that it is true that the progress has been made, but there are a lot of work has to be done in the future.
That's where we'll wrap it up. Thank you for coming in today and giving us your thoughts on everything as well.
Thank you.
That wraps things up for me this week. I'll be back on Monday, but do stay tuned for our later newscast for all the latest from Korea and around the world. Thank you for watching and hope you join us again soon. Goodbye.
Mukbang is all the rage these days. One-man content creators from Korea have set ablaze a new global trend. Type in mukbang on YouTube and you retrieve tons of videos showing people eating delicious food.